Welcome to taking a look at Chapter 16, where we're going to focus on disease and epidemiology, which is really the um, study of the frequency and distribution of these diseases that are out there, and taking a look at how they are um, applying to different sorts of populations. So really, when you look at epidemiology, as it says here, you can be using statistics to analyze disease in a population. And part of epidemiology is also something known as etiology, which is really the study of the causes of disease. So there you're going back to Koch's postulates to really look at what the causative agent is. And with epidemiology, you can look at the dissemination or the spread of these particular kinds of pathogens throughout the population to try and understand some more about what's going on to both block the spread of transmission, but also to start examining ways to disrupt the transmission that is out there so that you can have some idea on how fast these things are spreading. And this, from what we've seen in spring 2020, this is something that is extremely important and something that should be paid attention to, even though, like I said, a lot of it does deal with statistics, which people don't necessarily understand, and unfortunately you tend to dismiss. If we look at the primary repository for the epidemiologic information in the U.S., we're looking at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, and they're basically responsible for keeping track of these infectious diseases nationwide. And they do work with the World Health Organization to get some idea on what's going on with the statistics for diseases across the world. And there are some specific reportable diseases that by law hospitals and doctors are required to report to the CDC, and others are actually reported on a voluntary basis. But you can see there's a wide spread of different things that are out there, and these would be the kind of etiological agents that are easily transmitted from one person to another. So we want to get a handle on this to try and deal with them as soon as possible, but also to try and make the healthcare fields aware of the presence of these things that are out there and what might be changing over the future in terms of disease transmission rates. And when you look at the CDC with this weekly report, they're looking at morbidity and mortality. And morbidity is just looking at the number of disease cases that are arising. And mortality, obviously, is measuring the number of deaths in the population. So every week, the CDC will put out this statistical information so that people can take a look and try and be aware of any changes that might be occurring. So this is something that's actually useful if you're going to go on a road trip through the U.S., so that you will know which cities to avoid there. Here we can take a look at some of the statistics that are commonly generated using the reports that are out there that are submitted to the CDC. And they're going to look at two really important kind of measures on what's going on with disease in the United States. And here, if we look at it for HIV, we can look at the prevalence and then the incidence. And if you look at the prevalence, what you're looking at is basically the total number of existing cases that are out there compared to the entire population. So you're really looking broadly at how many people are actually out there that have HIV in this graph, and we can see that there is this bump right here. So there's that very quick exponential growth of that, and then it plateaus out. And we can see that we have this nice steady growth here. And this is a little bit of a problem, because what's going on here is we're able to keep people alive because they have some antiviral treatments that are available. So people can still have this, and it's prevalent in the population. But the problem is it's not decreasing. And for that, that's where you want to look at the incidence rates over here, where you're looking at the number of total new cases there. And you can see that the total number of new cases is remaining pretty steady. So this kind of disease is in our population, and we have not been able to eradicate it because we can have people that are living much longer, as long as they are undergoing that highly active antiretroviral therapy with the cocktail of drugs to basically block the spread of the virus, but we can't completely eliminate it, because if you remember, with retroviruses, they are inserting as a provirus, so they are hanging out inside of these people's cells, and we don't have any mechanism in place for getting rid of those cells that are infected with HIV, because it's literally part of the cell, and every time those cells divide, you get your daughter cells that are pre-infected there. So the CDC and other organizations out there are going to be looking at prevalence and incidence to try and decide what's going on with diseases that are affecting their populations. And so we can take a look at patterns of incidence, or this frequency of the disease occurrence out there. And one of the things that they love to do is find the index case, the first person who actually ended up with the disease. And so they're doing that actively with COVID-19, trying to figure out where the index case was, the first person who had it, that effectively was the person who resulted in such a disruption across the world out there. And if you have looking at the incidence, the number of these new cases that are out there, and you find that you're looking at something, an infectious disease that is pretty steady. It's all over the place here in this example, and it's got a relatively constant frequency for occurring in that particular population. You're looking at something that is endemic. So another good example of this would be something like malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, or perhaps down in South America, that it's always constant, and you don't really see vast increases or decreases because people are constantly being bit by mosquitoes that are transmitting the plasmodium that's causing malaria. When you look at a sporadic kind of incidence, there you're looking at something that's occurring occasionally. So this would be almost random locations and at really irregular intervals. So something like ear infections. You could make the argument that people are developing these because they're going swimming in pools or lakes, and they develop, and there's really no way to get rid of them because it's a blockage. But if you did see an increase in that sporadic frequency, then you would know something weird is going on there. And when we look at this process, that's where the CDC is really focusing, is on these two guys over here, because if you have an epidemic, you've got a widespread occurrence of that disease occurring there. So this idea of epidemics are quick and many people are getting infected there. And that would be in a localized region. And if you go to a pandemic, you're going worldwide. And when we look at epidemics, they even qualify some different categories of those, from point source, where you have that single person, or maybe a single source like what John Snow found when he was looking at the cholera outbreak in London in the 1850s, and he traced it back to that water pump. You can have a common source epidemic, where you get a common exposure to a single source that can really spread out over time there. And then you have your propagated epidemic that's out there, where you've got something that's not only coming from a source, but then it's being spread from person to person. And that can actually cause this kind of thing to be really sustained over a long period of time in that population. So we really are on the lookout for an epidemic developing, and the pandemic, this is something we have to be more and more concerned about, because airplanes are out there, and we can have these people carrying these diseases all over the place in a relatively quick period of time here. And just to show you some of the things, when you look at this little guy here, this is showing some of the epidemiological statistics for New York. And if you look at this, you can see that we've got a first COVID-19 case here on March 1st. And when you're looking at this, you can see it took a little bit of a while for that thing to start spreading, but all of a sudden we go through this massive increase. So then the question is this prevalence or is this incidence? Well, if you look at that, look, new cases right there. So you're looking at the incidence. And when you see this massive jump right there, then you know that something is going on, and you're starting to look at an epidemic, because you're seeing a lot of new cases there over a relatively short time period. So you know that you've got something that is in your population, and it's starting to spread around there. If we look at this one over here, we can look at are death tolls that are happening there. So we started to see this increase in the number of cases there, and now all of a sudden we've got an increase in the death tolls. And you can see this is where people have been talking about flattening the curve there, that you have that exponential growth and then you want to start seeing that decrease, and you know that the incidence rate is dropping down there, and it's still out there, but at least you are doing something to control the spread of that. And we can see, depending on the different states that you're looking at, we have different rates to that, and a lot of this is dependent on the population and the density of that. And this is one of those cases where living in a big city is not necessarily a good thing, because these kinds of things are going to be able to spread much faster as you have that more dense population localized in that one region right there. So kind of an interesting thing to take a look at, some of these statistical measures there. We can also start to take a look at these contagious diseases and how they're transmitted. And so these modes of disease transmissions are broken down in this nice little figure here to show some of these. And when we look at this, remember, microbes are in nearly every habitat on the biosphere. Most of them are not going to cause harm to us, but we do have a few out there that are regular pathogens, and we also have our opportunistic pathogens that when they get access to somebody, they're going to use that person as their incubator. We can look at where these things are found out there is what's known as a reservoir of infection, and that's really this permanent place where this pathogen is going to be able to reside. And when you look at a carrier, there's a person who shelters that pathogen, and then they can spread it to others. And this could be something like a nurse who gets sneezed on, or you could even have an asymptomatic carrier. Somebody who is has HIV and doesn't know it, or you can look in the book, they give a reference to Typhoid Mary, who was an actual person out there. So when we look at this mode of disease transmission, it could be direct, and there you have this direct contact, or you get this droplet spread, so somebody sneezing and things that are spread around. And that's where we go into this airborne side over here. But the one thing that's kind of interesting is this idea of this vehicle-borne transmission, and this would be through non-living reservoirs. So you can get exposed to a pathogen in the soil or the water and the air. And the water is a big worry when we look internationally, because not all countries actually do treat their sewage, so you've got that big fecal-oral route circle going on with these vehicle-borne transmissions. The last thing over here, we can take a look at kind of an interesting little thing associated with vectors. And a vector, unlike in math, a vector in epidemiology is where you're looking at a live animal that's actually transmitting that agent, that pathogen from one person to another. And what we know is the majority of vectors that are out there are actually arthropods. So think insects and spiders and ticks and that sort of stuff. And we can see in one example over here what's known as a mechanical vector, where the insect is really just transporting that pathogen or the infectious agent. It could be a toxin that's out there from one location to another. So here your fly is walking around on a little piece of crap. It comes over to your food, crawls around, and then you eat the food. So this mechanical vector basically transported the thing to cause the disease there, as opposed to a biological vector over here, where this one, that organism is actively participating in the life cycle for the pathogen. So here we can look at this process where a mosquito is actually infected with Plasmodium, and when you get bit by it, they are actually transferring that to you. So that organism is able to actually replicate or multiply, and part of its life cycle is inside of our vector out there. And when we look at this, there is this other interesting kind of feature that we can consider there that we've seen a little bit in the labs, and that's the difference between a definitive host and an intermediate host. And the preferred host for the parasite is the definitive host, and it's often associated with the location where the parasite is going to be reproducing in it, where it reaches sexual maturity, versus the intermediate host, which is where the parasite is able to go through immature parts of its life cycle, or it's able to reproduce asexually. And if you remember, we can see a distinct difference when we look at protozoan parasites that tend to have the definitive host is the insect, whereas when we looked at the worms, the definitive host was us, and they were going through an intermediate host like a snail or a fish or another organism out there where they could reproduce asexually. The one thing that I do want a lot of you to think about, especially if you're going into the healthcare field, is this idea that hospitals are where sick people are. And if you look at this cartoon over here, it's kind of funny, but just think about the patient in the next bed is highly infectious. Thank God for these curtains here. It turns out after the registered nurses in the hospital, one of the biggest ways of transmitting infections is actually these curtains that are out there, because those don't necessarily get cleaned regularly, and you could have this transmission of pathogens from one patient to another occurring, whether it's through droplets or things that are stuck on those curtains there. So when we look at this idea of nosocomial infections that are out there, this is something that is really what a person can acquire or develop during a hospital stay. And when you look at this, it's kind of amazing to think about that these ranges for this can be as low as 0.1% or maybe 1 in 1,000 versus up to 20%. And so that's a huge number of patients that are out there that could potentially be picking up an infection just by being in the presence of that hospital. And when you look at this, really the goal is to try and reduce the amount of contamination. So remember that idea of aseptic technique, and you can look at it to try and limit that spread from person to person, but also when you go into the operating room, you want to make sure that you are reducing the chances of an infection developing from the surgical kind of treatment there. And you can see a lot of these infections are coming from surgical sites and wounds, but also we've got this huge amount of urinary tract infections that can potentially be developing. The last thing, just to remind you, is we can take a look at this idea of diseases that are new or increasing in incidence. And you can see they're all over the planet here. We don't see them down here in Antarctica because they don't report those statistics, but there are a lot of newly identified microbes that are out there, including something like the coronavirus or some new strains of influenza, but also there's these re-emerging diseases out there like tuberculosis or Lyme disease and West Nile virus that are present, but they're starting to make a comeback as we encroach further into territories where they've sort of been laying out there dormant.